Thanks be to God.
So I am guessing that most, if not all of you in here this morning are familiar with that story, though I'm not going to make you raise your hand if you're not. And I would almost bet that a large number of people who aren't even church folks have at least some familiarity with that story, because the expression being a good Samaritan has kind of made it into our lexicon of expressions. In fact, it's even made it into our laws, right? There are Good Samaritan laws that try to encourage people to do good deeds for one another without fear of being sued, right? If I'm laying by the side of the road, beaten and left for half dead, I don't want somebody worrying about whether they should help me or not. I just want them to jump in and help me now, right? And so those laws are to try to help ameliorate that sort of situation. So I'm guessing that this is a pretty familiar parable, both within and without the church. And as opposed to some parables that are kind of difficult to understand. Sometimes some of Jesus' parables leave us scratching our head a little bit. The parable of the dishonest manager in Matthew, for one, leaves people going, huh? But the Good Samaritan, that's pretty straightforward, right? Guy asks, who is my neighbor? Jesus tells this story. There's a priest who goes by, does nothing. Levite who goes by, does nothing. Both of these who are like insiders, supposed to be helpful. And then this ultimate outsider, right? The Samaritan, who maybe if a lot of Jews of that time were telling stories would say, and then the Samaritan came in, people might go, boo, like a melodrama. And it's the Samaritan who stops and doesn't just stop, but does all this stuff, right? Pours oil and wine on the wounds, bandages him, sticks him on the donkey, takes him to an inn, stays with him, gets up the next morning, right? Gives the innkeeper money, says, take care of this guy, and if I still owe you more money, I'll be back. He goes to the nth mile. And it's a pretty straightforward story, right? Okay, we get it. And then the gospel writer, Luke, writes it down. And no longer is just a story that's told orally and we get the flat meaning of it right away, but it becomes something that we start to read. And when you pick up a book, your imagination starts going, right? When you see the words in print, it goes beyond just hearing it. You start to put yourself in the story, and it makes for great fodder for preacher people like me and like Rochelle and like Pastor Linda and any other preacher people Dave, we have lots of preacher people in here. You don't realize this, do you? We have many preacher people. We're all nerds, and we love putting things into the story, and our imaginations go wild. So I started imagining what exactly, if this were not a parable, but if this were really happening, what would it look like? How might we make this into a movie or a documentary, right? So the lawyer testing Jesus. It says in the scripture he wants to justify himself. That's sort of a weird expression, isn't it? What I think of when I read that is, any of you who use Microsoft Word and you can adjust the margins, there's one of the little boxes that's justify that makes it so that on the left side, and I'm doing this for you because this is your left, on the right side, that they all go down the page evenly and it spreads out the words just so. It sets margins, and the lawyer wants to set margins. Who is my neighbor? Who is inside the margins? And what he's really asking is not so much who is my neighbor, but who is not my neighbor that I can get away with not loving. He's looking for the loopholes, right? When he asks Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus, instead of answering with the story, could easily have answered, "Whoever you're most afraid I'm going to say is your neighbor." Who would you be most afraid of hearing is your neighbor who needs your special attention, who pushes your buttons of outrage these days, whose comments do you read on Facebook and frown? Oh, crap, that's my neighbor. And so Jesus answers with this story. And who comes down the road? Well, first of all, there's this road. I think we need to figure out the road first. So the road is running from Jerusalem to Jericho. And it says in the scripture that the road goes from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Now, usually when you and I think of down, we think of direction. So like Lynn Winter goes down south for the winter. Or we live downstate, right? So we think of, on a map, south. But Jerusalem to Jericho goes north. So down is not anything to do with direction. It's all about elevation. So imagine, if you would, our sanctuary actually runs just right. I'm facing north right now, which helps me tremendously when I'm trying to do directions for you. I know that when I need to point east, that I can go that way and yada, yada, yada. So we'll pretend that I am now in Jerusalem, right? And I am up. And the road to Jericho doesn't just go to the back of the sanctuary, but in order to really make it look right, we're going to have to go all the way down the stairs to Flint Street. Because the elevation on this road is crazy. Back in 1999, when I had the chance to go to Israel, we took a bus down this same road. It is now paved. The folks in that day probably would have liked that. And it is really steep. Jerusalem is 2,600 miles above sea level. What did I just say? Oh, sorry. Boop, 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 boop. When Jesus ascended, he just went to Jerusalem, right? Yeah. Thank you. You know, when I was reading this the other day, they gave it both in metric and in regular, so I probably was like thinking meters and feet at the same time, and it turned into miles. Well, feet. Thank you. 2,600 feet above sea level. Jericho is 750 feet below sea level. Yeah. Yeah, if water got into the Jordan Valley, it would just wash out the whole thing. Most of that is way below sea level. So imagine how steep. And the road itself, depending on where you're measuring from and to, is anywhere from 15 to 18 miles long. That's all it is. And you're going that many thousand feet down or up over that period of time. It makes me wonder, I don't know, this is just Larry doing his crazy speculation. Not only is this a good road for bandits because it's between two trade centers, Jerusalem and Jericho, and people are going to be carrying money, but if you're walking that road, either up or down, you're going to be tired. You're going to be unable, likely, to defend yourself very easily, so it's pretty easy to get wiped out there. So there's this man that we don't know anything about his background other than he's been traveling the road and that he's been not only robbed, but just beaten and stripped and left half dead there at the side of the road. And who's the first character who comes along? The priest. All right. So this priest and a Levite, and we're going, wait a minute, I thought like Levites were priests, and what's the differentiation? So I actually had to do an extra little dab of research this week. There's kind of a hierarchy in the priesthood. The top dog is the high priest, whom you might remember from all our Jesus stories being Annas was kind of the high priest emeritus. He was high priest for most of Jesus' life until toward the end when his son-in-law Caiaphas is high priest. The high priest is the only one who gets to go into the Holy of Holies in the temple once a year for the Day of Atonement, gives that sacrifice, and administratively he is the head over all of the other priests and is quite a power player. Below the high priest, there are regular priests who are divided up into divisions. The heads of those divisions are the chief priests. Sometimes in the gospel we read about the chief priests and the scribes. And the priests, they are in charge of everything to do with the altar in the temple. And they come in week-long shifts. So you're kind of on again, off again, whether you're working in the temple or not. And then all the divisions of priests are supposed to be there during the 7 big feast days, Passover, Shavuot, all that good stuff. So this priest, I envision in my Larry Does the Good Samaritan movie, is coming from Jerusalem, just finishing his shift in the temple. And he's heading home, and he sees what might well be a dead man because he can't see him breathing. Again, this is all speculation, right? Jesus leaves us all to our sanctified imagination. So in my sanctified imagination, this priest is like, oh my goodness, I just got done doing all these sacrifices and I'm ritually clean and I'm halfway home. And if I go anywhere near this guy within 6 feet, I will be unclean and I'll have to turn right back around and go through all the ritual cleansing again. And surely there is somebody else behind me on the road who can deal with this. La, 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 la. And he walks on. Then there's who's the second character? The Levite. The Levite is a priest, but of a different order. If you think about in the Methodist Church how there are elders and deacons, the Levites are the deacons. They take care of not just anything to do with the altar, but anything in the sanctuary proper. They cleanse the vessels. They prepare the cereal offerings. Sometimes they're gatekeepers. Sometimes they're porters, schlepping stuff around. There are some of the Levites who are actually musicians, who are choristers or instrumentalists, although there are additional musicians too. And believe it or not, there are like lots and lots of priests and very few Levites. It's about a 10-to-1 ratio of priest to Levite. So the Levites are really busy. So I am imagining that the Levite is walking in a different direction from the priest. He's heading to Jerusalem because they have to spend way more time in the temple than just a regular priest does because they have so much more to do and there's so much fewer of them. And I can envision him like just wrapped up in all the stuff he's got to do. He's got the list, right? Have you have days like those, right? When you wake up and the first thing that pops into your head is your to-do list. And it's just like overwhelming and you hardly want to get out of bed because you know there's so much things that need to be done and you finally do, and then you're sort of in this haze where it's like A and B and C and D, and he's walking along and maybe he sees the guy, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he sort of sees him but doesn't really see him. Do you ever do that? Yeah. Thanks. Some of my questions are rhetorical. Others I'm like looking for an actual answer. That was good. Yeah. We do that all the time, right? We sort of see, but we don't really see because we're wrapped up in stuff. And so my Levite in my Good Samaritan movie would be this well-intentioned guy, but is just so wrapped up in life that he doesn't attend to the man. And then the Samaritan comes along. We don't know which direction the Samaritan's going. There's no real clue there. He's likely taking that road because he's either coming from his home in Samaria or going back to it. When you go from Jerusalem down to Jericho, you get over by the Jordan River Valley. So for instance, when most Jews would come from Galilee to Jerusalem, they would never come straight through Samaria. That would be unclean. We don't want to go through Samaria. So they would cross the Jordan to the east. I'm actually pointing the right direction. And then they would go down, and then they would recross the Jordan when they got to Judea so they could bypass Samaria altogether. A Samaritan, you're wondering, why on earth is the Samaritan in Judea? Well, why on earth would a Michigan fan do business in Columbus? Because it has to be done, right? Why do Spartans eat in Ann Arbor? Because there are good restaurants. So occasionally Samaritans would have to be in Judea. It's just kind of the way of the world. But he could easily have gone across the Jordan and down to go through just as little of Judea as absolutely necessary in order to do whatever business he had in Jericho or Jerusalem. People have asked, and it's a great question, how would you know if somebody was a Samaritan as a Jew? They didn't look different. They weren't really a different ethnicity. So really, if the Samaritan stayed quiet, kept to himself, nobody would necessarily know. But as soon as he spoke, Samaritans spoke in a Samaritan Hebrew. Most Jews at that time, like Jesus, spoke in Aramaic, so you would be able to tell from his language. So the Samaritan, the biggest leap of faith he took was going to the innkeeper and speaking to the innkeeper, because then the innkeeper would know, oh, this is a Samaritan. And all the while he would feel definitely not at home. And yet the Samaritan was willing to get outside of himself and do this. Let's go back to the margins, right? So the lawyer wanted to figure out who's inside and who's outside. The margin for the priest was purity, right? I got to follow the purity code, and that's not all bad. There were good things about the purity code. There was a lot of that was instructed by God to do these things. But for the priest, it became a hard and a fast line. For the Levite, his margins seemed to be just life itself, the visor. He could only see what he had to do next, and not anything outside of that. The Samaritan was willing to color outside the lines. Samaritans had similar purity laws to Jews. They followed the first 5 books, the Torah. It would have been not a good thing for the Samaritan to touch a corpse either. And yet he was willing to risk that. There are a lot of people who think that when Jesus tells this parable, that he's thinking of himself as the Good Samaritan, because so many times he's the one who's willing to color outside the lines, to step outside the box for the sake of another human being, for the sake of love. It's not a bad thing to have margins. It's not a bad thing to have a plan. Jesus himself had a plan. You might remember toward the beginning of John's gospel when his mother Mary says, "They are without wine." Hint, hint. You should make some wine. And Jesus says to his own mother, "It's not my hour yet." And like a good passive-aggressive mother would do, she then turns to the stewards and says, "Do whatever he tells you, because he's about to tell you to do something." And he does. He steps out. The plan was, this is not my hour yet. But mom says, "But there's a need in front of you, son." And that's the most important thing. And Jesus does it. You might remember the Syrophoenician woman or the Canaanite woman, depending on which of the synoptic gospels you're reading, right? Who asks Jesus to heal her daughter. And Jesus says, "No, wait, that's not the plan. My plan is Jews first, Gentiles second. So no, I got to feed the children at the table first before I feed the dogs." There's a whole other thing wrapped up in that I won't get into just right now. But the woman says, "But even the dogs get crumbs from the children's table." And Jesus goes, click. Yeah, I know this was the plan, But you know what? It's time to color outside the lines. And he heals the daughter. He learns this lesson well enough that later on, shortly before he himself is to be crucified, and a woman comes to him at table with a jar of expensive perfume and breaks it open and puts it on his feet. And in John's gospel, it's Judas who complains. In the other gospels, it's just some random disciple that complains. Just think about this, Jesus, that expensive perfume. If it had been sold, how much money that would be that the poor could be fed. And Jesus says, yeah, that is the plan, that we always take care of the poor. But that opportunity will always be there. And she's seeing to the need that's right in front of her. She's stepping outside of the lines, stepping outside of the plan to show love and give her a break. And that is what we're asked to do over and over again. Whatever our plans are, which are great, whatever the margins that are set up, whatever the roadway looks like that we're set on, we have to follow it. But there are some times where we're called to the side of the road or off-road. We're called to step outside of ourselves and our comfort and our peace to attend in some loving way to somebody else that's in need. Let us be called off-road with Jesus. Amen.